Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of January, and in today's concise update, we're looking at the unfolding of the Battle of Velyka Novosilka, in addition to clashes on the Andriivka, Pokrvosk, Chasiv Yar, and Kursk fronts. That's going to be very interesting to look at by the end of today's video. So before we get into it, please like and subscribe so we can grow the channel. But let's begin by looking at the course of the battle here in Velyka Novosilka. The Russian forces continue advancing along the same eastern highway that I mentioned in yesterday's video, and now they've been able to capture essentially every single house north of the Shaitanka River, creating a very ambiguous predicament because we don't know what's going on over here, but there may or may not be a Ukrainian presence remaining south of the Shaitanka River. Some Russian sources claim that there are still Ukrainian vestiges located in these school regions, drugstore, grocery store that's pretty close to the Shaitanka River, which in its own right is pretty narrow. So moving back and forth is not that difficult, but once you leave a basement and try to cross an open area, that's when it becomes really difficult with the Russian reconnaissance drones flying above head during daylight hours and just a massive amount of firepower, especially helicopters being utilized. Low-lying attack helicopters, in addition to mortars, artillery, and drones, are being utilized on a regular basis by the Russian side, both on the city center, but also on the Ukrainians coming in to provide support for the corridor, the 2,700 meter wide corridor, and at this point is actually closer to 2.5 kilometers wide. In addition, there is also a lot of firepower being directed towards the Ukrainian forces that are trying to withdraw from the pocket. Now, according to some Russian sources, as I said before, there remains this very small pocket of Ukrainian resistance near this region in the southern portion of the town, and that it's now been cut off by Russian forces as a result of the connection between the eastern part of Velyka Novosilka and the area basically near the Mokreli River where you have Vermivka. Now, this is not confirmed yet because we don't have geolocations of the Russians cutting off the center of the town, but if that were to be the case, then it would leave probably several dozen Ukrainian soldiers in actual physical encirclement, and it's really easy to get caught up in that sort of trap because of the various water barriers and the difficulty of moving from one place to another with the significant amount of pressure coming really to the Ukrainian side from all directions, whether it be from the south, where there is a ridge overlooking the river valley on which Vermivka is located, to the east, where you also have this pretty high elevated ridge, and then also to the west, you have a higher elevated region. So all of that plays a factor in why now you have this chokehold on Velyka Novosilka that's making it difficult for the Ukrainians to have freedom of action and defense. But regardless of that fact, they are still trying to resist and protract fighting for as long as possible. This is mainly being done by the 110th Mechanized Brigade, in addition to 2 battalions of the Presidential Brigade. There are a few other units over here, some drone crews and smaller rifle battalions that are involved in the clashes. But for the most part, the vanguard forces are the ones that are of the highest caliber in this region. So that's why they're being tasked with this role. But inevitably, they're also the ones that will experience the highest losses proportionally from the Ukrainian side. And so there was a video of Russian forces entering into some of the houses in Velyka Novosilka, probably on the eastern approaches, and they see those 4 dead Ukrainian soldiers from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. And that's a reflection of how a lot of them were or had no other choice but to fight in close quarters combats against Russian soldiers that were advancing from house to house, from basement to basement. A lot of it coming from this Russian grouping of the 40th Brigade, 36th, and 131st Motor Rifle Regiment, with a lot of armored support advancing along this highway, coming from that 5th Guards Tank Brigade that we've discussed so often. But regardless of what's happening with the southern pockets, there is still the larger grouping of Ukrainian forces that remains with this blue categorization because there is a noticeable Ukrainian presence that the Russians have been able to push out yet or to cut off yet, because there is that 2.5 kilometer corridor that basically runs across the Mokreli River as well, meaning it's difficult to move in and out at this point. What happens is, as I discussed in yesterday's video, you have to go in pretty small groups, preferably during nighttime hours, to reach the Mokreli River, cross it in a quick manner, utilizing whenever it's possible shrubbery and just concealment via trees and foliage. And then you have to coordinate with a external element, probably some sort of exfil in an armored vehicle, and then just beeline all the way northwards to an area where you do have populated regions. But for now, there are still Ukrainian companies over here. I don't know the extent. I would say that it is definitely on the lower end. If you have some sort of estimate, then always go for the lower side, because really, regardless of whether or not they're located in the pocket or not, more generally, the estimate for the amount of Ukrainian forces that are in total operating around here is probably on the lower end. I think I said 15,000 in an earlier video. And a lot of the time, I'm operating on the assumption that the Ukrainian brigades and their infantry within those battalions that are fighting at the front line, they don't have full capacity, but at least have a sizable portion of their infantry available for the fighting. And obviously, that's really dependent on the case by case situation. And so I can't guarantee that all the time. But in this area over here, I'd say maybe a bit more than 100, but it's not going to exceed more than that. Any other number that's like in the couple of hundreds, reaching towards 1,000 number, that's just unrealistic given the small size of what remains of Velyka Novosilka and the lack of video footage so far of a mass amount of uh, forces being taken POW or bodies being uncovered. Although it could happen in the future, so we're going to keep an eye out to see when or whether those videos get published. They probably will, but not to an extreme degree because of the nature of the way that the Ukrainians resist in pockets when they're enveloped on all three sides, except for the one final corridor route, and then they're able to make it out. The reason why it's so different over here is because all three sides that are flanking the Russians or the Ukrainians within the city, they're on higher elevation, and it's not even close. It's just a massive mismatch in favor of the Russian side. There's also the infantry deficits that we discussed in yesterday's video for the Ukrainian garrison over here, in addition to all the attrition advantages the Russians have due to their better momentum and use of a wide array of firepower. So all that plays a role in making it more difficult for the Ukrainians to drag out the fighting over here. But as you can see, it's now been almost a week of this sort of predicament for the Ukrainians where they are forced to hold on to this corridor and they are still dragging out the fighting. It does lead to heavier costs, but what it does do is unlock enough time for the Ukrainians on the rear to build up further defenses, anti-tank ditches, and trenches that are located south of Komar and will have to be prepared in order to prevent further Russian exploitations along the Mokriali River Valley that could take over the rest of this higher elevated ridge that is just south of the Vovcha River Valley. That's a really big concern that the Ukrainians have to account for looking forward following the fall of Velyka Novosilka. And it sort of ties into what we're going to talk about now, because the Russian forces north of Sukhyali, they took over 0.7 square kilometers in the Yantarnia region. They also captured over here in Shevchenko 5.6 square kilometers of territory. We talked about this yesterday, how there were Ukrainian vestiges located in some of these forward outposts, a lot of very dense trenches that are difficult to dislodge. But instead of assaulting them head on, the Russian forces attacked the settlements located to the north and the south, respectively, and created a situation where movement in and out of the pocket was extremely difficult, forcing whatever remnants were left to withdraw unilaterally and without any hope of returning. So now the Russians have been able to establish this pretty solid line of contact, which allows them to now have more leverage in Western Shevchenko, as can be seen with this geolocation from January 19th from the Raid Battalion. It's an unmanned systems battalion that is now operating around here in conjunction with the 35th Marine Brigade. They hit a house in Western Shevchenko, indicating a Russian presence over here. So the fighting has sort of been relegated to these outskirts of the town, and the Ukrainians are hoping to keep it there because now they've lost control of some sort of the forward positions that were used to distract the Russians. So now the hope is just going to be to hold out the fighting near this road over here and near some of the other remaining trenches, instead of it being pushed westwards along this paved road to the outskirts of Andriivka. That would be the worst case scenario, because then the pressure would be so close to Andriivka that any preparations for long-term defensive activity here would be futile, and the battle would actually begin to commence. Looking a bit to the north, though, the Ukrainians have also been pushed out of other open fields, a lot of them located on relatively high elevation. Honestly, for the most part, you have this entire region that I'm going to highlight with this red perimeter. It's basically to the east of, I think that's Novopavlivka, but you can't see the full name over there. And it's also located north of Andriivka and the Vovcha River Valley. This region that is largely under Ukrainian control, but now could also fall into Russian hands between the Donetsk and Dnipro border. It's on really high elevation, and the exceptions would be the areas where you see populated regions. And we're not talking about anything large. We're talking about a couple of villages and hamlets, but they're usually connected by some sort of chain. And that's where you could tell that there is a lower elevation. So, for instance, this line over here that the Russians are attacking through, or say this one over here, there may be a few other ones like here, and you get that the idea of the Russian forces would like to get control over those fields in order to have some sort of dominating points to overlook the supply lines and overlook the areas where the Ukrainians are entrenched within, and by proxy of that, eventually begin to storm into those populated areas and take over large swaths of fields that could be used to flank the areas that are needed to cut off roads or to enter into larger cities like Andriivka from the north. That's an example. Or to just reach the anti-tank ditch that is separating Dnipro from Donetsk. That is another target. So this entire region, it's really full of potential for Russian exploitations, and the Ukrainians, they are aware of that, but due to a lot of their forces being dispersed among other key parts of the front line that have been in dire need of reinforcements, like the Dakhne pockets, and now you can see there has been a bit of a stabilization measure due to the reinforcements. It's also needed to a certain degree over here, but to the north, because the Russians are continuing to chip away at Ukrainian holdings at a pretty significant pace, which is eventually going to catch up to the Ukrainians located in the Dakhne pockets, even if they're able to protect themselves from frontal assaults. That northern flank is something that they cannot account for at the moment. The Russians here captured 6 square kilometers of territory that is located south of Yastove and Ukrainka. And they've also been able to enter into Novoandrivka by utilizing the low-lying path over here with tree lines that are running parallel to it. It's an area that the Ukrainians simply were unable to retain control over, and it was the perfect route for Russian infantry to begin their attacks. So then the Russians branched out and have now been able to enter into Novoandrivka, and the hope is to then expand control deeper into Sribni and then run along this entire valley and capture all of the remaining villages here, with support coming in from the rear and from the flanks by capturing the open fields that are a higher elevation. Then that will all play a role in providing the Russians with a pretty strong southern flank to take over Nadivka, where the Ukrainians have a pretty solid line right now they're trying to retain control over. All with the understanding that if they're unable to do that, then the line of defense built around the oblast borders will become the next step for the Russians. And it's a fear for the Ukrainians. They really do not like the proposition of the Russians being able to enter into another oblast and begin to negatively affect a lot of these rear towns that a couple of months ago weren't even within the Overton window of being considered up as a target that the Russians could then take in control over. So now we're entering into this sort of uncharted territory. And a lot of that includes the Novopavlivka region, which is on low elevation and is also a pretty large artillery hub for the 148th Artillery Brigade. Looking to the north, though, now you have some sort of conclusion to the Battle of Novosilivka, as admitted to by Ukrainian sources. But the Ukrainians are claiming that the 59th Brigade that was defending over here was grossly outnumbered by Russian forces that really largely came from the 27th Motor Rifle Division. So let's look at the units that were involved in the capture, and now they're going to be involved with advancing, let's see, about 6 kilometers westwards to reach the border with Dnipro. So you have over here the 506th Motor Rifle Regiment, 907th. That's a new one that I hadn't even heard of before. You have the 24th Special Purpose Brigade. They've been involved for a while, but I didn't really mention them. They were pretty big during the Avdiivka period of time. You also have the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade and the 433rd Motor Rifle Regiment. So some of those units, especially the ones that don't have icons that are actually individualized, they were newly created over the past year and have been used during different time periods as sort of stopgaps. If a more experienced unit is in the process of restoration, it gets moved in and fills that gap and continues the momentum of the previous Russian units. So now you have to the north, the Russian forces also advancing and taking over most of Kotline. There is a bit of ambiguity about the residential areas, but based on this geolocation from January 23rd of an FPV strike onto a tree line north of Kotline, it does appear that the Russians have been able to take over the entirety of the of the Pokrovsk number 2 mine and of the nearby warehouse and parking lots. So you can see that over here with 11 or 1.13 square kilometers of territory being captured, and the Russians advancing along this tree line to nearly reach this particular mine shaft. The Ukrainians really did fight tooth and nail with the resources that had provided to them in this location, but the Russians were always going to have the upper hand in the sense that they were able to seep into a pretty small surface area, and by that point, the specific material factors at the front line, they become the biggest factors in whether the Russians are able to expand control or whether the Ukrainians are able to hang by. So, because of the significant Russian commitment and the previous momentum from capturing Vovkove, Pischana, etc., they are already in a very prime position, located on several higher elevated regions north of the Solana River, to take over Kotline, advance along the rail line. And the Ukrainians over here, they just have a difficult logistical situation as well, because there are no other nearby settlements where they can base themselves in. So they were all forced to sort of situate near the front line. And if not, then they would be in these open areas, like in tree lines, where they would be extremely susceptible to Russian fire. The closest thing would be Serhivka. And that's a concern that now the Ukrainians are going to have to deal with, because Udachny is the final populated area running along this rail line that is still a part of the Donetsk Oblast. And if it falls in the near future, then there will basically be no nearby positions for the Ukrainians to coalesce around on the sort of western flank of Pokrovsk, meaning that the Russians will be able to seize additional territory, and that would eventually include this part of the coking plant. Or I don't think that's a coking plant, but this is a coal facility. There are other areas that are coking plants already under Russian control, and it would be a large swath of open fields on higher elevation that would overlook the rear of Dnipro, like Mezhova, but also the approaches to Pokrovsk itself, and would help the Russians with that urban battle greatly. Now, when it comes to the ring road and the highway leading into Mirnorod, the Russian forces have been able to push towards Baranivka, capturing another 2.3 square kilometers of territory, largely on lower elevation, because this entire region spanning from Baranivka all the way northwards to, say, Yablunivka is on low elevation. So I'll mark that with a red line, but then I'll show you guys the areas that are on higher elevation. So, for instance, to the east over here, you just have this massive ridge, and it's sandwiched in between these two valleys. Then you also have this higher elevated region that runs near and actually on top of the highway in certain regions. And it also includes these areas over here. These are also on a pretty high elevation. But the areas where you do have chains of villages, they tend to be on lower lying regions. In this case, the Russian forces, they have not experienced that much resistance due to the Ukrainians not putting a lot of emphasis onto defending this location. The area that the Ukrainians have been focusing the most on holding on to is the physical connection of the highway. And some Russian sources and Ukrainian sources alike actually claim that my map is an exaggeration, and that the Ukrainians still retain control over the physical parts of the highway, but that the Russians are getting closer and closer to it. So the 14th and parts of the 15th National Guards Brigade over here, you have the 111th Territorial Defense Brigade, and you have the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade operating around here, but not necessarily around Baranivka. So that's an area where the 5th Oplot Motor Rifle Brigade has been able to make a bit of a headway through. Looking at the Chasiv Yar region, we could see over here just some slight Russian advances, including this gain into the core of the city. Just not even 2 hectares in size, but based on this geolocation, is from the Ragog drone unit of the 24th Mechanized Brigade, showing FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers from the 98th VDV division as they entered into the refractory plant and into some of the nearby structures. And over here, you can see that the Russians advanced through the Novopivnishny district, the westernmost district of Chasiv Yar, and its nearby rail line and facilities like these two warehouses over here. And this is coming from the 18th Slavic National Guard Brigade with their FPV strikes on the 23rd of January. So just once again, the Russians chipping away at holdings on the northern flank and at the edges of the core of what remains of Chasiv Yar. And to finish off, I do want to show you guys the situation in Kursk, because over here we do have an interesting geolocation. This was published by the 225th Assault Battalion. You can see them over here. It's been one of the key units involved in defending against Russian attacks coming from Zeleny Shlaich. In the footage, they indicate that HIMARS were used to shell Russian forward positions in this forested patch just to the north of Sverdlikovo using cluster munitions. And that geolocation can be seen over here. In total, if we were going to take the maximalist view of this, we could see that the Russians advanced a total of 4.5 kilometers. But if we're looking at a minimum, the Russians advanced, let's see, it would be around 3 kilometers. Still a pretty significant advance either way. And it is being done largely along the same paved road. This paved road has been important for the Ukrainians throughout the Kursk operation because it connects Verdlikovo to Suja, but now it's having the opposite effect because the Russians are using it to a great effect in order to take control of a lot of the final territories that they lost control over. And even in a lot of these areas where villages are separated by a couple of kilometers, they're able to reach them in a sort of faster manner, the Russian side, due to this access to this one specific road. There are not many roads in this part of the southern Kursk region close to the Sumy border. So the Ukrainians really need to make use of whatever they have, because you have to imagine they're making these long journeys, these logistical convoys that the Ukrainians have, and they have to go through a lot of dense forests, and then they have to make it into Kursk, and then from there split off into various pockets that are also very dangerous and pretty deep. So it's a pretty long journey for them. And they don't have use of a lot of paved roads. They have very few, and now the Russians are chipping away at the very few that they do have access to. And a lot of that goes through Sverdlikovo. Sverdlikovo is actually a pretty important conduit between the rear and front line for the Ukrainians over here in Kursk. And now it's not necessarily been infiltrated into, but the Russians are extremely close to doing so because of their recent capture of this 3.7 square kilometer piece of territory. In addition, they also expanded control of the Russians into some of these open fields, and this was recorded by the 36th Marine Brigade and the Alliance drone group, where they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers that were hiding near and under an abandoned Ukrainian PBFV 302 infantry fighting vehicle, which was donated by Sweden. And regardless of that, there were also some significant Russian columns that were used to push through the line of contact east of Nizhny Klin and reach Verdlikovo in the first place. And that occurred on January 22nd. And the Ukrainians from the 36th Brigade and the Elephant team at an FPV group, they published their results where they were able to destroy one Russian IMR-2. They were able to destroy 9 Russian BMDs. And in the video, there's also a recorded abandoned BMD-2 of the Russian side, along with one destroyed and one abandoned armored fighting vehicle. So a lot of this coming from elements of 98th, 106 VDV brigades, or sorry, divisions. And you can see those units marked over here on the map, in addition to the 810th and 155th Naval Infantry Brigades that you can see marked on the unit deployment section of this map as well. So that is all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.